It is a great honor and a privilege to introduce Birthe Tage. Your maiden name is Marcus, and you from Denmark, and the most amazing miracle, how the Danish Jews were saved. So Birthe, we're here in your beautiful home in Hendon in London, and I'm so grateful to be here. And if you could relate your incredible story.
Nice to meet you. So I will read my story.
Please.
It's my name is Birthe. It's very Danish. My escape to Sweden. On April the 9th, 1940, Denmark was invaded by Germany in a surprise attack, so forceful that Denmark had no possibility of resisting and could do nothing but to capitulate in hours. During the first years of occupation, the resistance was slack, and the population, including the Jews, could go about their daily lives more or less unhindered. Germany soon began to tighten their grip on Denmark and introduce harsh measures, including the death penalty. Extra German police had been recruited, and transport ships had been arranged for a planned deportation. Illegal resistance, unregistered demonstrations, as well as a general strike took place. In protest, the Danish government resigned on August the 29th, 1943. I remember very well how the position was for us at that time. We had blackout blinds. We had air raids very often from the Allies when sirens were sounded, and we had to leave our flat and go to the shelter in the basement. I remember seeing the sugar factory burning not far from us through a small window. It was very frightening. Sometimes we just sat in the entrance to our flat, not to be too close to any windows. We could hear the sirens and the bombing. The Danish King Christian X, in spite of the occupation, continued his morning ride on his horse through the streets of Copenhagen, unarmed and without escort. He did not wear the Star of David. The king and the Danish government stated that there is no Jewish question here in Denmark. For the Danish people, the Jews were Danish and therefore were treated as equals. The rescue of the Jews from Denmark to Sweden in October 1943 is one of the biggest events in the nation's history. The Danish people's unselfish effort was unique towards their Jewish fellow men, while in the other European countries the story was a completely different caliber. A German bureaucrat, a Navy official in Copenhagen, George Ferdinand Duchwitz, leaked the plan to a Danish parliamentarian that there was a plan to deport the whole Jewish community during the week of Friday night, October the 1st, 1943. This Danish parliamentarian contacted the chief rabbi and informed him of this terrible news. It was the evening of Rosh Hashanah when the chief rabbi Marcus Melchior announced in the synagogue that nobody should come to the service of Rosh Hashanah but wait for instructions on how to escape. The chief rabbi then instructed all Jews to tell everyone to go into hiding and prepare to leave. The Danish resistance received a complete list of the Jewish community together with addresses and telephone numbers. The Danish people themselves assisted in finding hiding places among themselves and neighbors and friends. Together with the Danish resistance, they all organized escape routes on fishing boats from all over the east coast of Denmark. Unfortunately, the Gestapo broke into the Jewish community center and seized a list of the Jewish membership so they knew where everybody was. The German Nazi in charge of Denmark at that time, Werner Best, known as the Bloodhound of Paris, had the plan instructed by Hitler to get rid of all the Jews in Denmark. The chief rabbi instructed everybody to go to their homes and hide and await instructions which would come from the Danish resistance. Werner Best already knew then that the Germans would lose the war. He was selfish and wanted to be known as a good man so as not to be in the Nuremberg trial. Duckwitz, in the meantime, had gone to Sweden to contact the Prime Minister of Sweden, who agreed to receive the Danish Jews. Were it not for Duckwitz, who later became West Germany's ambassador to Denmark, the miracle Øresund is the water between Denmark and Sweden, would not have been possible. The Nazis had a policy of not making too much trouble because Denmark supplied the German army with all its agricultural products, butter, milk, cheese, as well as meat and bread, and most likely Danish beer. It was Erev Rosh Hashanah 1943, and everything had been prepared for the Rosh Hashanah meal with all the family attending. My father received a call from the resistance to take his family out of the flat the next day. But he did not take it so seriously until a second call was made to him, where he was told that if you want to live, you have to leave immediately. He was told not to take any baggage and not walk as a family, my parents and my two sisters. But for some reason, my mother took silver cutlery and handkerchiefs, thinking that we would only be away a few days. We then followed the instructions and went to the main train station. We walked, my father alone, my mother alone, Sister Alice alone, and my sister Vera and I together. Vera was holding my hand. I'm the youngest one of three sisters. Alice is the oldest, Vera the middle, and I'm the youngest. Vera was holding my hand very tightly, not to lose me. We then took the train to Snekkersten. Snekkersten is a small village north of Copenhagen. It's a small fishing village north of Copenhagen where we used to rent a house every summer. We sat in different compartments so not to attract attention. We were not allowed to talk to each other. As Vera was only 9 years old, we did not know when to get off the train until my mother came past us, tapped Vera on the shoulder and whispered, "Next stop." The Germans were patrolling the streets and the stations, and we had to be very careful. We had to walk below the hedges not to be seen. My mother had telephoned a small pension to ask them for a room where we could hide for one night. But we were refused. The pension was full and we couldn't come in. We then decided to go to a fisherman's home from where we used to rent for the summer holidays. They received us with open arms and made us as comfortable as possible. It so happened that somebody denounced the pension hotel to the Nazis, who then arrested all the guests and deported them to Theresienstadt. It's not a concentration camp. How lucky we were. Many Jews were hidden in friends' houses, hospital and churches. My brother-in-law, Johan Grün, and his brother Olaf were not so lucky, as they were found hiding on a small wooden pier in Niveau, another fishing village, and were deported to Theresienstadt. However, they received food parcels and clothing from the Danish Red Cross, which helped them both to survive. But they were very traumatized. Sorry about my mistakes.
It's amazing.
The next day, a man in a raincoat knocked at the door and informed us that we had to go immediately without fail to the harbour, where a fishing boat was waiting for us to take us over Öresund to Sweden. Once again, we had to go separately, and my father and my sister Alice went first. My father and Alice got to the boat quickly, but my mother, Vera, and I could not cross the road Strandvejen, as the Germans were patrolling, and we had to hide between the hedges. When there was a gap between the German patrols, my mother managed to run across the road with Vera and me, and we just made it in time before the fishermen moved out of the harbour. My father had to pay quite a lot of money to the fishermen, but interestingly, there was a collection for people who could not afford to pay the fishermen. We must all realize that we were on a fishing boat that smelled of fish, and we had to go down under the bridge to hide. We were together with 2 other families, and it was very claustrophobic. The fishermen had to open the hatch very often, so my mother's sister, Auntie Sarah, could go up and down, I think to get to breathe some fresh air. And this was dangerous, as the German boats were patrolling. The sea was not very calm, and some of us were very sick, which all made the atmosphere on this fishing boat very unpleasant. Normally it would take about 30 minutes to cross the water to Sweden, but the fishermen had to dodge German patrol boats, and it took about 4 hours. To ease the tension, the men were singing songs in Yiddish. We were told not to speak a word and be quiet, so they stopped singing. We had to stop many times, as spotlights shone on our boat by the Germans. We stopped the engine, waited for some minutes, and it felt like years. It was sad to look back on dark Denmark, wondering if we would ever get there again, and looking forward to neutral freedom to Sweden with all its light, not knowing if we would ever reach her shores. It must have been terrible for our parents and the other grown-ups. We were just children, and of course did not realize the seriousness of the whole situation. I must mention that today, when you go to Sweden at the narrowest point, nearly where we had left, it takes with the ferry approximately 15 minutes. Our crossing that night took a long time. The miracle had happened. We had been rescued. As we approached the city of Helsingborg in Sweden waters, a large ship took us all on board and host us with cold water to clean us up. To get on the ship was not easy, as we had to climb up a wooden ladder on the side of the ship. The Swedish authorities took us to the Grand Hotel, where we stayed one night and slept in beds next to each other in the big hall. The staff were very nice, took our wet clothes and brought them back the next morning. In the meantime, in the middle of the night, we were woken up by the Swedish police to be registered as we were refugees. They needed to ask our names, ages, and also who we were. We were there for quite a few hours. When we arrived in Sweden, we were refugees fleeing from German-occupied Denmark. When we left Denmark, we had nothing with us. Our stay in Sweden lasted 20 months. At the beginning, we were organized by the Swedish authorities. They decided where we should stay, where the children should go to school, and how we would receive food and clothing. During the absence of the Jews, the Danish authorities did their utmost to protect the property and other interests, including the Torah scrolls in the crypt of Trinity Church, where they were hidden during the whole of the war, thanks to the resistance. In addition, the Danish resistance went to various homes and packed clothing and other belongings which was shipped to Sweden. The resistance had used our flat in Vestervoldgade, and we had so many bullet holes in our back door to our backyard. All this happened while we were refugees in Sweden from October 1943 to May 1945. We were all looked after by a special Danish refugee administration established under the auspices of the Danish embassy in Stockholm. Okay. The day after the night in the Grand Hotel, we left for Höganäs, where we slept in bunk beds and ate in a very large hall. This was a brand new camp. Sorry. This was a brand new camp for soldiers, which smelled of new wood. The food was behind large glass counters, and specially Swedish bread, which smelled sensational. Even today, you can buy that bread in Copenhagen, and that smell always reminds me of Höganäs. We met there my cousin Musi and her son Stefan. From there we moved to a small Swedish town called Thuringe, but we had a converted flat. We lived in one bedroom, the 5 of us. Next to the bedroom was a little attic room, which stored only apples from floor to ceiling. Sorry about my voice. My mother, who was very practical, only thought about converting the store into a small kitchen. She succeeded in doing so. So we had a small kitchen, but the smell of apples was still there. My father even succeeded to make Pesach there. We got the Mattes from Stockholm, and another family joined us, a family called Korsen. My mother managed to make borscht soup, and my mother's sister Sarah and her husband Elias came too. As we had hardly any clothes with us, we received second-hand and sometimes new clothing from a distribution center in a large garage. We also queued up for toys. I remember clearly that I had a doll, and Vera, my sister Vera, wanted a car. One day we received our big truck from Copenhagen with all our clothes. The Danish resistance were fantastic. They had gone to our flat, packed some of our clothes, and sent them to us in Sweden. I went to a Danish school in the basement. You could hardly call it a school, just a group of Danish children and a Danish teacher. We only had 2 school books. Vera and Alice went to senior schools. We moved again half a year later to another home, where we had a first flat with a balcony. A first floor flat, with a balcony. The Swedish owner, a lady, had a telephone upstairs, which was very rare in those days. My father became a salesman and was sometimes away a few days at a time. He even went to Stockholm, and we often had to wait a long time before his telephone calls came through. It was a highlight event when my mother received the calls, and the lady was always very nice and let us use her telephone. My mother, Vera, and I went to Stockholm for a few days. We stayed in a little hotel. I remember it well. Alice was studying in Gothenburg, where she stayed with Auntie Sarah. You are wondering what happened to my grandma, because she was not with us when we left the flat. She was taken the next day by the resistance by ambulance to Amager to a friend called Ida. It was then arranged for her to go by boat to Sweden together with their cousin Leo Grabowski with his family to an island called Lidingö. My father's sister Leah and her husband Arnold, who lived in Thuringe, and his older sister Zelda and her husband David lived in another Swedish town called Söderköping. After a few weeks, my father arranged to become independent and look for better accommodation, as well as finding work for himself in order to make a better living. That is when we moved to Gothenburg, the next biggest town in Sweden. He became a representative to a company to sell photographic articles. We had a small flat in number 9 Engelbrektsgatan. Vera and I slept in the lounge with my parents and Alice in the kitchen. Each morning we had this delicious Swedish bolla and ögon cocoa as you say in English, sitting on Alice's bed in the kitchen. I'm just telling my story. My mother's sister, Auntie Sarah and Uncle Elias, lived above us. We had no radio, so every time and every day when the BBC news was on, they would bang on the floor and we all rushed up to hear the BBC news in Danish from London. This was uncensored news, whereby we were able to follow developments on the different fronts. We stayed in that flat until the end of the war, 5th of May 1945, until the end of German occupation in Denmark. Vera and I went to Danish schools, while my older sister Alice went to a Swedish one. We had a good life there, considering that we lived in Sweden a year and a half. The Danish school was quite far away from where we lived. I walked every day alone with my school bag and a large hat on. On the 4th of May 1945, the news came through that the Germans had surrendered and Denmark, Holland, Belgium and France were free. We then all ran down to the street singing and dancing with Danish flags. What a special feeling, and I still get goose pimples when I think of it. Even I get it now. Altogether, we spent 20 months in Sweden. Norway was liberated after us, namely on the 17th of May. We heard that in Copenhagen in the evening of the 4th of May, the population put candles in their windows, a tradition that still remains today. Upon our return to Denmark, our family was lucky to find all our belongings intact. However, the owner of our building had taken one room of our flat and attached it to his flat. However, we moved 2 years later to the 3rd floor and had the room back. Back in Copenhagen, there were bunkers everywhere where people would have been hiding during the Blitz. Food was very short and we had to have coupons for everything: milk, bread, butter, eggs, tea, coffee, etc. Sometimes the greengrocer would tell my mother she could have no bananas as she had already had them in Sweden. We were very lucky to be Danes, as the Danes treated us as equals. Sweden was neutral. They were good to us, but at the same time they were good to the Germans, and some people would even say Heil Hitler. The general population were quite friendly to us, but in some ways were irritated by the number of refugees that had come to their country. I think on the whole we children had a lovely time, but our parents must have been very apprehensive, not knowing what the future would bring. The Danish Refuge Administration organized and paid for our return from Sweden soon after Liberation Day. There were approximately 7,500 Jews in Denmark. About 7,000 were saved. 476 were deported to Theresienstadt, the concentration camp in Czechoslovakia. 80 people died a natural death, mostly older people. This was a show camp by the Nazis to show the world that life was like normal. Theresienstadt was one of the mildest camps compared with Auschwitz. The whole Danish police force was taken to Sachsenhausen in 1944. Toward the end of the war in mid-April 1945, all Jewish and non-Jewish Danish concentration camp prisoners were liberated and brought to Sweden by white buses provided by the Swedish Red Cross, headed by Count Folke Bernadotte. It was Danish medical doctors who insisted that the Danish Jews from Theresienstadt should also be freed. They drove from Theresienstadt through Germany, which was completely destroyed, through to Denmark. When the people arrived, they had to be in quarantine a short time because of the illnesses they had to endure. It must be noted that the Danish people and the Danish authorities acted with exceptional humanity and support during and after the war. Recognition must also go to Sweden. The country showed extreme helpfulness, and without Sweden, the rescue and the shelter it so graciously provided, we would not have survived. No wonder that these events have affected us for the rest of our life. But we were so lucky, and for that we are forever grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Birthe. You have a picture of the boat on the cover.
The boat is here.
It was a very small boat.
Yeah.
It's a fishing boat.
It's a fishing boat.
And the window here was open sometimes.
And on the other side...
That's me when I was small.
And how old were you when
I was 6 years old, 6 years.
When you were 6 years old?
Yeah, I was 6 and became 7.5. I was there a year and a half in Sweden.
Yeah.
We were there a year and a half. So I was 7.5 when I came home.
Actually.
And this picture, is this picture taken still in Denmark?
Yes,
I'm
yes.
better now already.
But I was 6 years old.
4 days.
Michael, finish.
Yeah.
I was 6 years
I've
old.
just got somebody here going through.
But it was a fantastic experience, and something we'll never forget. And we have so many stories.
Morning, yeah.
And my father,
Okay, fine. Sorry about
he
this.
loved to act, and he was member of a group who acted in Thüringen, and he was on the stage. And I can go on and go on the whole time.
But if I can ask you, what message do you impart to your children and grandchildren?
From the trip?
Just from your experiences, how Denmark and Sweden were unique, very unique.
Yeah, very unique, very. The Danish people were unbelievable. We were treated like Danes, not like Jews are not Jews. Didn't come in to talk. We were just saved, and the fishermen risked their own lives for us. They could have been taken by the Germans. By the way, there were many Jews who did not survive the trip to Sweden. Some people drowned because the boat they were in were not very strong. And my cousin, for example, he rowed the boat. He rowed a boat. He was a rower. He was a member of a club which rowed boats, and he saved some very famous people in the boat. It was I can't remember the names. Who?
Arne Jacobsen.
Yeah, Arne Jacobsen, who designed all the furniture, and another famous man. He was unbelievable. He rowed the whole way to Sweden and took those 3 or 4 people with him. And when he arrived in Sweden, he collapsed completely because
From exhaustion.
From exhaustion, he rowed the whole way.
8 hours.
There's stories. There's so many. I have 2 of my cousin's stories here in the drawer, which is completely different. But we were all saved from different parts of Denmark, but mostly of the coastline, where all the small villages were. And some people were taken in Gilleleje, which is a very famous story. They were hidden in the church in the roof of the church, but somebody renounced. You say renounced. Denounced them.
Or informed on it.
Informed the Germans that they were hidden there.
So Birthe, I just want to thank you so, Birthe, I just want to thank you so much. I'm so grateful.
It's my pleasure.
Your story, and it's miracles.
It's just
really miracles.
It's just my personal story. We all have personal stories because everybody was saved in a different way.
Yeah.
Everybody, all the Jewish people were saved. All have different stories. Some arrived in Stockholm, some arrived in Gothenburg, I don't know. They all came to different towns in Sweden, and different people, and very much different.
But Birthe, if I can ask you, what message do you give to your children or grandchildren if they ask?
What do you want me to tell them? That we were lucky to be alive. We were the luckiest Jews to be alive in Europe because we were saved by and the fishermen, of course, as I said, I repeat, they gave their lives, because without the fishermen, I don't know how we would have escaped.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so grateful to you, and you should just have mazel and bracha.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And in good health, and just have all the nachas in the world.
Thank you very much.
And really, it's been such an honor and a privilege to be here.
It was my pleasure. My pleasure.